Well, it is a great honor for me to introduce A Man Who Loved Women by François Truffaut in this program curated by Wes Anderson, and I would like to thank the French Institute Alliance Française for this invitation. François Truffaut was an amazing director, and with Jean-Luc Godard, Claude Chabrol, Éric Rohmer, Jacques Rivette, and others from the left bank, he was a prominent member of the French New Wave. French cinema lovers are well aware of this and of the fact that Truffaut was well known and appreciated for this challenging new way of using the cinematic narratives in his films. The narrative density is sometimes so strong that we can have this impression to read a book, a novel. Good one, of course. We also have this extensive use of the voiceover, this emphasis on the complex psychology of the characters, and the sophisticated plot structure. Those are the trademarks of Truffaut's unique style. And before, of course, before becoming a director, Truffaut was this brazen young critic who was constantly penning the old-school French cinema in his articles in Les Cahiers du Cinéma. He was attacking the older generations, people like the directors Autant Lara, Delannoy, screenwriters like Orange, Bost, considering that they were making this bourgeois and old-fashioned cinema. But paradoxically, those reproaches were later addressed to the older Truffaut, who as a filmmaker was sometimes ready to favor a more classical style in order to express himself. So Truffaut was part of the new wave, but he has this very strong singularity. And he considered his work as a kind of a process of sublimation of his personal life, or let's say a recreation, a re-editing of his own life. He was born in Paris in 1936 from an unknown father and very young mother, and he was raised by his grandmother until the age of 8 when she died. He was not loved by his mother, and that was perhaps the source of his trauma. He frequently skipped school and sneaked into theaters, as it is told in the 400 Blows. He was sent into an institution for juvenile delinquent. So he had this very difficult period during his teenage years, an enrollment in the army, several attempts of suicide. And then he was welcomed and protected by André Bazin, his mentor. He was welcomed in his house, and finally he found his way as a film critic in Les Cahiers du Cinéma and other review magazine. And because of all this suffering he endured when he was a child, and the subsequent trauma experimented during his adulthood, Truffaut would consider that, and I quote, life is made of pieces that are not able to connect together. And perhaps in his movies, we find that there is this attempt to successfully put those fragments of life together, to try to give them the meaning, the coherence, and the depth that desperately lack in the real world. And perhaps The Man Who Loved Women would be a perfect artistic example of this quest, of this ideal. It was shot just after Adèle with Isabelle Adjani, after Pocket Money, L'Argent de Poche, one of his most successful films. And The Man Who Loved Women was written with Michel Fermot and Suzanne Schiffman during the year 1977. Truffaut was, back then, he was playing a French scientist in Encounter of the Third Kind. And the fun fact is that he was writing a part of the script when he was shooting this Spielberg movie. So The Man Who Loved Women was shot in Montpellier, with the great Charles Denner, Brigitte Fossey, Nelly Borgeaud, and the famous and wonderful Leslie Caron. It was commercially successful. And in many ways, the 400 Blows and The Man Who Loved Woman are connected because the main characters of those two movies shares the same childhood traumas, which are in fact the childhood traumas of Truffaut himself. But the only focus on The Man Who Loved Woman is this erotic obsession of a middle-aged man who is not ashamed to be a womanizer, but who is curious enough about himself to begin a sincere introspection, which is in fact the core of the movie. So Bertrand Morin really wants to understand why he is this single-minded and compulsive seducer unable to commit. And that's why he begins this inquiry, which is basically the writing of the book, a journal of his numerous feminine conquests. So some critics were irritated by this literary style of the film and the succession of man-woman routines, which can be perceived as a kind of repertoire of variation about the process of seduction. But on the other hand, you have critics like Melissa E. Biggs expressing their admiration for this movie, saying that it was an extraordinary movie, and I quote, made at just the right time when sexual obsession could still be ironic and celebrated, and not held up to scorn by political correctness and feminist righteousness. So the paradox of this movie, which is about lust and desire, is that you will not find one sequence where you can see a sexual act depicted. In fact, Truffaut's movie is all about one thing, and that would be the scopic drive. In the same way, perhaps, as movie like The Peeping Tom by Michael Powell, or even Eyes Wide Shut by Stanley Kubrick. In fact, The Man Who Loved Woman is a movie about what is now called the male gaze. In other terms, this tendency for a typical heterosexual man to objectify or sexualize a woman through the prism of a visual media. And that's why I think it is a very interesting challenge to watch and to try to analyze this movie today. Is it a movie like, is this movie like a documentary about a patriarchal and retrograde old world where women are only considered as mean to achieve a sexual drive and are not as true individual? Or is this movie more profound than what it seems at first glance? Does it say something interesting and meaningful about the human psyche or even the gender issues? For sure, this movie we're going to watch raises many questions. For instance, are we all conditioned by cultural stereotypes? Does our unconscious mind have a polarized gender, imposing its own drives and desires? Or is it the expression of kind of Oedipal childhood trauma, or the effect of the dictates of society? Is the scopic drive, the male gaze of the hero, counteracted by his literary introspection? Can this extensive use of the literary language by the womanizer be seen as a female attribute in contrast with his all-powerful male gaze, which, as you are going to discover, is also a death drive? So what is really going on here? What is at stake at a psychoanalytical level? And what does reveal the tension between, on one hand, the eroticized images, and on the other, the literary voiceover that is shaping the whole structure of the plot, giving it meaning, organizing the events, the ellipses, and the black and white flashbacks. So I will let you make your own opinion about that. But what I can say is that in its own very novelistic and personal way, Truffaut, Truffaut's take on what we can call perhaps a new love disorder of the modern age is not outdated and much more complex than it seems. And it's very funny.